Hello, folks. Welcome to the Genuinely Interested podcast. My name is Roy Bensby, and I'm your host. And I want to explain a little bit about the podcast before we start the show this week. This podcast is an opportunity for me to speak with some of the most interesting people I know that I can find on the internet. So, either with amazing talents or achievements or just unbelievable life stories or invaluable insights into areas that they have dedicated their lives to studying. I sit down with these amazing individuals from all across the world. Really, I've talked to people from Slovenia to the Czech Republic to Australia to countries in Africa and South America, really just all over the world. And I try to ask them the questions that will hopefully help you extract something valuable or learn something new or just get inspired by. And I do hope that you do get inspired by these talks with some sort of a call to action, maybe change something that you wanted to change for a while, or even just enjoy, detaching from the world for an hour and listening to some great conversations. So whatever it is that you get from this, I do hope that you extract something from it and enjoy the conversations. All these episodes are available on all the major podcast platforms, iTunes, Spotify, Google, and the rest of them. You can also find the episodes on my website, which is roybensv.com. You can find a lot of other information about me there as well, from photos to a little bit more insights into who I am, if you're interested. And, you can always go to social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me there. I'm pretty active on both those platforms, although the only ones I have. And I try to post regularly so you can stay up to date. And also be sure to put your email on the website. I shoot emails out with updates, news, any new current information that I have will be sent via those emails and social media platforms. So yeah, make sure you're in the loop. All right, guys, today on the podcast, I have Andrew Copson. Andrew is the chief executive at Humanist UK. He is also an author, his latest book being The Little Book of Humanism, Universal Lessons on Finding Purpose, Meaning, and Joy. And he co-authored this with Alice Roberts. On the podcast today, we covered a whole host of topics, some a little less popular, some a little more popular, but it was a lot around secularism, humanism, atheism, religion, free speech. We talked a lot about free speech. Should there be limits on free speech? What constitutes hate speech? What doesn't? Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very different how people see that in the UK and maybe the rest of the world as well, and how people see that here in the US, where free speech is in the Constitution. It's completely different, but it was a really fun conversation to have, a really fun kind of just mental exercise to see how people on the other side of the pond feel about it. We discussed what it would mean to have a secular state and how much influence should or shouldn't religious powers, affiliations, structures should have in our governing institutions, in our schools, and why we need a separation of church and state, which we have in the Constitution of the US. But the reality seems to be a little different nowadays. I'm happy me and Andrew managed to schedule this because I love this episode. This was really fun. It's a really fun conversation, and I hope you guys enjoyed as well. So without further ado, here is Andrew Copson. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Hey, Andrew.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for being on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanist UK, right?
That's it.
Can you explain to people who might not know what Humanist is, maybe a little bit more in detail?
Sure. Well, in the UK, the word humanist has been used for about the last couple of hundred years to refer to someone who has a non-religious approach to life, a distinctively non-religious approach to life. So a humanist is, in this definition, someone who doesn't think that the universe is a place that has been created with some sort of supernatural element, but instead accepts that it's a natural phenomenon, that we make sense of it with our senses and with the organized enterprise of science. A humanist is also someone who thinks that when we ask ourselves how we should treat other people, what the right and wrong thing to do is, we don't follow rules and commandments that claim to have come from outside of human beings, but instead we trust to our empathy and our reason to decide on an assessment of the consequences of our actions, what the right thing to do is. So it's a sort of human welfare focused morality based on empathy and fellow feeling. And I guess another important part of the definition of what a humanist believes is something about meaning. Humanists are people who think that the universe doesn't have any direction, it doesn't have any trajectory, there's not some big cosmic story in a purposive sense that we're part of, but instead meaning is something that human beings give to our life, something that we create through the things that we do, the people we connect with, the aims that we have, and the lives that we lead, which we believe, humanists, obviously, that there's only one life. So many long books of multiple volumes have been written about the humanist approach to life and the humanist philosophy, but that's a summary.
And can you maybe explain to people, because I've heard a few terms kind of being clumped together. So humanist, atheist, secularist, and for people who may not know the distinct differences between the three, could you maybe explain?
Well, sure. So there's the UK and the US, of course, are two countries separated by a common language. And that is as true in relation to these terms as it is into others, because I'm very conscious that the definition of the word humanist that I've just given is very much a UK English definition. In the US, definitions are slightly different. You mentioned the word secularist. That's another word that's a word where the two definitions in the US and the UK are very, very different. So in the UK, a secularist would be someone who wanted to see political institutions separated from religious institutions, wanted to see freedom of religion and belief, no discrimination by the state on religious grounds. Whereas in the US, although the word secularist also means that, I understand that it can mean something much broader and just mean a non-religious person who takes a non-religious approach to life. That the word isn't used that way in the UK. So I think it is. I think it's only used that way in the US, actually, and in the US as well. Sometimes you call humanism secular humanism, which we also don't do in the UK. In the UK, humanism just is secular. Humanism is a non-religious thing. So there's those differences. I suppose the word that we use in the same way in the US and the UK is atheist, right? So that's the easiest one to define, I suppose. There's an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in any gods, or hasn't got a belief in gods, or I suppose someone who doesn't even think about that question, just lives their life as if there are no gods, because it's irrelevant to them. The question is irrelevant to them. That's where I fit, by the way. I'm not someone who's ever used the word atheist about myself, because I just couldn't care less about that question. It's just a completely meaningless question to me in my life. I've never been taught that there were gods. I've never been encouraged to think that there were, and so on. And it's not something that interests me. So, nonetheless, I am an atheist. Obviously, definitionally, if an alien sociologist were observing me and decided to label my beliefs about God, they would say, "Oh, that entity is an atheist." And I'm definitely a humanist. My beliefs and values fit that definition, and I do take that on as an identity as well. And I'm certainly a secularist in the sense that I want to see that sort of political settlement. What I'd be in America, I don't know. Probably all the same words, but you might add secular after the humanist, before the humanist.
Yeah. In America, you would be the same. You would just have a little bit of a twang in your accent, but that's How did you grow up? Did you grow up in a religious household, in a secular household?
Not in a religious household at all. No, not my parents, not my grandparents, not my great grandparents. I think this is another thing that's quite different between the UK and the US, is that over half the UK now self-defines as not religious, and a large proportion of those people weren't raised religious either, right? So religion has low social importance in the UK. It's not something that is part of most people's upbringing. So I was typical of that. I was perhaps a little bit more unusual in that there were, I suppose, 4 generations of my family that were non-religious. Me, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. I mean, these were just non-religious people. People of humanist values, people of a sort of common sense, non-religious approach, and that's the way that I was raised.
Yeah, the U.S. I believe is the most religious Western nation, and it's, I think, one of the only countries, at least in the West, that an openly atheist person could never run for president because it's looked down upon by the majority of people as amoral, someone who's lacking ethics, a moral compass, etc.
Yeah, I think from statistics and surveys, it looks like it's improving people's attitudes towards non-religious people there. But it is true. I mean, of course, this hasn't always been the case in the US. It's quite a it's really been very strongly since the mid 20th century that people have adopted rather harsher views of non-religious people. Although, of course, there's always been very religious people in the US. The strange thing about the US, I always think, and it's the opposite of the UK in this respect, is that in the US, you've got the most secularist constitution in the world, probably, but certainly in the Western world, maybe equally with France. But like you say, the most religious population. Whereas in the UK, we've got the least religious population. I mean, we're the most non-religious population in the world, up there with New Zealand, and a couple of the Nordic countries, so there's just really not religious society. But the UK has the most religious constitution in the Western world. So, we've got bishops in our parliament making laws. The head of state is also the head of the national church. The church controls a third of our public schools in our state's schools. You have to be the child of Christians to get in there, even though your tax is paying for them. We're the only country in the world, in the UK, to mandate by law daily Christian prayers in every public school, every state school. So it's huge. So we're on paper, well, and in fact, we're the most Christian state, in the world. Maybe Denmark is a bit similar. They have a church that's quite similar to England's. But then the people are the most non-religious in the world, and then the US is like the opposite in both respects. So it's very interesting to me. I mean, they're two different sort of things to think about, because, of course, the question in the UK that you think that an intelligent observer asks themselves is, why is it that the population puts up with this? Why do they put up with that situation, having this state? And in the US, you ask yourself, how can it be that the most secular constitution, political settlement in the world, has produced this religious society as a result? And I think that's a less difficult question to answer, because, of course, the fact is that secular constitutions can produce very religious populations because they actually create a space for religious freedom. Yeah, they allow freedom of choice and freedom of religion. And so that sort of means that you do get a lot of religions flourishing, and religion becomes very powerful as a social institution. Whereas there might be, ironically, in the UK, it might be said that if you've got a state church, which is sort of powerful and privileged and hierarchical, it maybe puts everyone off, and they just they don't think it belongs to them. They don't think about it. And so there's nothing, so personal religion declines. But anyway, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And in the US right now, and I mean, I don't know how it was back then, but I'm imagining it's just becoming worse, where, like you said, there is a separation of church and state technically, but it feels like any law that's being passed right now is either God-given or endorsed by God, and it's all backed by God. It doesn't matter if it's abortion, immigration, mass, like anything. And this is just becoming increasingly worse, where you have the separation of church and state. Like I said, technically, it feels like it's not there anymore. Although technically,
well, you've been going through a difficult period.
Yeah, it's not been the best 4 years. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is serious. I mean, it's of all the many things that could be said about the Trump administration and the wider movement of which he's part, both nationally and internationally. One of the standout things about it is it's leaning on Christianity. I mean, Steve Bannon, who obviously is no longer a feature even of the Trump administration, but I remember him in 2014 it was, so a good clear 6 years ago, he gave a speech at the Vatican at a right-wing Christian conference about how the West had to be more Judeo-Christian, get back to Christian nationalism. And that Christian nationalism, which is also embodied in Europe in places like Hungary, or in Russia, in Putin's Russia, anywhere almost where there's a sort of authoritarian, they like to think of themselves as strong men, but I think of them as bully boys, wherever there's a sort of authoritarian government of that type, you find Christian nationalism in the West. And the Trump administration has been a standout example of Christian nationalism. It's probably been the most Christian nationalist regime in the world these last 4 years. I mean, I've been amazed by what they've been allowed to get away with. The denial of federal funded healthcare to people on religious grounds. They've stopped enforcing laws separating church and state. Essentially, like you've said, the Establishment Clause. Forget it.
And he's the least Christian guy in the world. He's literally the least Christian person alive.
But he
doesn't care about anything.
Oh, doesn't he?
Trump?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know him personally.
I thought he was
obviously,
a Christian. Yeah.
I mean, he's anything that
he appeared with the Bible, and
I don't think he's ever read a page. I doubt it.
Well, most Christians haven't.
They've had a lot of interviews where they asked him, "What's your favorite phrase? What's your favorite line? And he just like, it's a great book. I love the whole book. It's a fabulous book." Well, so he has no idea. He just placates to
that's a reflection of his general ignorance.
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, anyway, his friends all very Christian, aren't they? And so the evangelical Protestant NGOs and that broader movement within the US has had a very successful 4 years. So I understand what you're saying, how it can feel that way. I would hope. I mean, you need to sort of put it in some perspective. Even in the last 4 years, the United States has, in reality, been one of the most secular countries in the world.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, even the limitations that you've managed to retain these last 4 years are unusual in the world. The norm around the world, whether it's Islamic states or Christian states, whatever, is not to have any separation at all. So, I mean, you're falling. You may be falling, but you're falling from a high base. A high beginning base. But I mean, I think the indications are that Biden-Harris will turn things back. I mean, Senator Harris has supported the Do No Harm bill in the Senate that would reintroduce restrictions on discriminating in the name of religion, which is good. And of course, President-elect Biden is a good example of a religious person who is on the record as saying that he doesn't think that his personal religious belief should tie the hands of other people and affect other people's life choices. And I mean, that's an excellent secularist principle. And so hopefully you could be on the verge of a great restoration of American secularism. Let's hope so, because it's an important example for the world, really.
100%. It's I fear that we're going to get to a point where, Trump came into office, he undid a lot of laws and regulations that Obama put into place. And then Biden's going to come into office. He's going to do a lot of what Trump did. And then the next guy is going to come after Biden. And it's just going to be this cycle where they keep undoing each other's
Do you think
laws.
I mean, I would hope that a Biden administration will start to look at building in some safeguards, because clearly your constitutional safeguards, although they've prevented, they've still worked quite well. I mean, Trump is going to leave office, so to that extent, your constitution has worked. But it came very close, didn't it? I mean, it was just a few millimeters of the way, and he might have fought it and won. So I think that hopefully your next president will strengthen some of those safeguards, because, like you say, otherwise you just end up with a series of elected dictators, and you loosen all the safeguards that exist to limit executive power, and that is a problem. I think that's probably the biggest risk for the American Constitution in the future.
Yeah, I think that it proved that the institutions held. Like the fact that everyone thought we were on the brink of an authoritarian dictator and he's just going to stay in power forever. And we saw that was not the case. We saw that the institution held. There was no coup. There was no meltdown. Like, it was a relative outside of him himself as a character and all the vile things that he said.
Yeah.
Majority of the things were fairly normal. There wasn't too much change happening. So I think that should give people confidence in fact that America is not going to slide into what they thought it would.
Yeah, I hope so. But 50 years or 100 years from now, that could easily look different. I think it's when you get a shock like this, it's the time to do some institution renovation, rebuilding and strengthening.
Yeah, I agree. So
in the UK, of course, there are hardly any limits on executive power at all, apart from the courts. So,
really,
yeah, it's a parliamentary because we don't have a constitution. So technically, Parliament can do whatever it wants, within the boundaries of the law.
I had a period where I would enjoy watching hours of the people in Parliament in England just banter with one another in I don't know what it's called, House of Lords or whatever it is, that they're
House
just
of Commons is the green one. Was it green? Was it people shouting at each other? Yeah.
Yeah. It is as good as entertainment as you will see anywhere. It's so good.
Yeah, I suppose it. I suppose it is, but whether you want your politics to be entertaining is the question. I'd rather that my politics were less entertaining and more effective.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why it's because it's another country. I can kind of laugh, and I'm like,
yes,
all right,
you can look
this isn't happening here. It's happening somewhere else.
Yes.
So as far as humanists, would the humanist goal, would that be to eliminate religious institutions, religion in schools, just have a completely secular society? Would that be the ultimate goal?
So humanist organizations like ours, and we celebrate our 125th anniversary next year. So we've been going for some time. The goals of humanist organizations, of which there are humanist organizations exist in most countries in the world now. The goals of humanist organizations aren't to eliminate religion. They're to increase public understanding of the humanist approach to life. But humanists tend to stand back from the idea that this should lead to some sort of eradication of other people's beliefs. And that's mainly because it's foundational to a humanist idea of what a good society is like, that people should have freedom of choice. Human diversity, including the diversity of beliefs, is an inescapable consequence of freedom. The moment that you allow people freedom, their choices diverge. They differ, and there's a diversity of thought introduced, and that's good. From a humanist point of view, it allows different ideas to be developed. It allows social progress. It allows it brings a richness to life and our experience of the other people in the world and all those benefits. And so a humanist position is not an eradicating one. Humanist organizations tend to exist to support people who already have humanist beliefs, to give them community services, maybe pastoral care or ceremonies, or in the countries where this is a problem, housing associations or adoption agencies or whatever, in countries where religion rules the roost, and people don't have access to those services without it. So humanist organizations do that. Humanist organizations also typically do advocate for social and political change, and the sort of things they advocate for are for a secular state. So for a system of public services which doesn't discriminate on religious grounds against service beneficiaries, vulnerable people, doesn't discriminate on religious grounds in employment, that doesn't promote any one religion or non-religious worldview onto people or use public money to do that. And in schools, as you imply, that would include learning about a range of different religious and non-religious worldviews. That's a typical feature of the agenda of humanist organizations, but not being indoctrinated into any one of those. Children are human beings too, and they too have the human right to freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of belief in line with their own developing maturity. And so that's what a humanist agenda is generally about. It's about freedom of choice, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, and spreading understanding of the humanist approach to life, because it is one that has typically been censored, oppressed, suppressed by political and religious authorities across the world for the last couple of thousand years. So certainly, letting that out and serve as an example to people. But principally, the social aim and political aim is one of freedom of choice.
Yeah. Well, I guess I meant more like you said, more on the individual, not on the individual level, but more on the institution level, more in like we said, in the school, in higher learning.
Yeah, yeah,
Job.
definitely. There, a separation of religion and the institutions is definitely a very important principle. And you know, nowhere in the world is that perfectly realized yet. There are degrees of separation in many countries, but nowhere has the perfect, you know, freedom of thought compatible state. And so it's towards that, as you say, that humanists would want to move things.
Yeah, it's all an experiment in the making. And, I always wonder if it's even possible for humans to live in a completely secular society. I mean, there's always going to be, I think that the human DNA is one that will follow people, right? Doesn't matter if it's Jesus, Muhammad, Keith Raniere from Nexium, or Steve Jobs, or Wim Hof, or even Donald Trump, right? As long as there's an individual that is charismatic enough and offers you salvation or promises to improve your life through XYZ, I think people will follow.
Yeah, I think they will. I just have to hope that there'll also always be people who will say, "Excuse me, 1 minute," you know, and ask questions, and criticize those ideas, satirize those leaders, and also over time, which is just as important, patiently build the institutions that will act as a curb on those people. You know, into the long term, because I think you're right. If there's a weakness in our species, one of many weaknesses, but if there's one clear weakness in our species, it is that we allow people to, and are sometimes actively complicit in, making it so that people emerge as leaders, you know, as strong people who inspire or threaten or cajole others into actions, unthinking actions, and that's something we have to mitigate. I mean, it's useful that we're consciously aware of that tendency in ourselves, and that we can, you know, build institutions like you were saying, but also do our own mental spring cleaning from time to time to remind ourselves that on you know, improve ourselves at a personal level, that actually this can be a very negative tendency, and it's much more productive to be critical, to be thoughtful, to be, you know, free thinking, and to curb the power and authority of any one individual.
Yeah, I think, when a lot of times when I hear intellectuals like yourself speak about these things, I'm like,
That's a bit,
it
it's a bit harsh.
No, it's true. It's there's for certain people, and I don't know, maybe in England, I feel like the culture of debate, like healthy debate, is much better than it is here in the U.S. I just don't see it as existing here, especially about topics that are sensitive, right?
Do you think people are too polite in the United States
Yeah.
compared with
Yeah.
the UK?
Yeah. Or too polite, or too scared to speak out of fear of being looked at as whatever it is, sexist, racist, Islamophobe, whatever the ism is. So yeah, I feel like in the US, in the UK, again, this is from just seeing a lot of talk shows and stuff. It just seems like a more open and good faith conversation.
I think it can be in some places, and is not in others. You know, I mean, there are worrying signs in things like social values surveys, social attitude surveys, that younger people in the UK, especially, are less likely to want to, you know, disagree with people on the basis of their most fundamental beliefs. For me, I don't know how I feel about that, because obviously the good thing that is showing is that people are more tolerant, but the bad thing that is showing is that people are that maybe that tolerance is a sort of indifference to other people's bad ideas, and they just think, oh, I don't want to touch that. You know, let them be them, and, you know, let's not have a debate about it. And of course, we know that the way that, you know, progress is made, the way that bad ideas are jettisoned in favor of better ideas, you know, is through debate and discussion. And so you have to both take on ideas you might disagree with, and also be willing yourself to be criticized and to have your own ideas, you know, exposed and discussed, and to do that to yourself as well on occasion. And I think that everywhere that spirit is reducing. I think that, you know, people of my grandparents' generation would be more likely to dispute companionably with people, amicably with people. Whereas today, people certainly younger than I am, and even people my own age, view the idea of disputation as conflict, not something they want to engage in. But I think that is a threat to all of us. That is a risk to all of us. It's interesting that you say that that's a difference between the United States and the UK, because I've always thought the other way around.
Really?
Yeah, I've always felt, looking at the United States, that people are more willing to just be disputatious and sort of ornery with each other as well, and just sort of like argue the toss of things, than in the UK, where people are perhaps more polite and reserved about it. Not in politics, perhaps. I can see why the House of Commons would look very vibrant from your point of view, compared with the Senate or something. I mean, you can see why. I can see why that would be. But often in the House of Commons, they're not really disagreeing; they're just sort of grandstanding and shouting, and so that's not genuine debate necessarily.
No, but they are very entertaining. They have that British wit, that dry humor that I personally love. So,
oh well, there you go. If you're an Anglophile, then you're going to enjoy it, whatever they say. Probably just their accents will do it for you.
Yeah, Americans, dude, they love the British and Australian accent. Scottish, unfortunately, I can't understand half of
the
what
Australian accent. You like the Australian accent?
The depends on
the accent.
It varies, right? I know, like, it varies, but
I never heard that.
Yeah,
I never heard that was a popular one.
I mean, there's a lot of Australians here in New York. A lot
of course.
Yeah, they do a great job. So yeah, it's we have to switch between niceties and then go into like these really difficult topics. It's funny.
Yes. Yes.
So switching to a difficult topic, with what we're currently seeing in the EU, with beheadings for free speech, attacks in Austria, in Mozambique, we saw 50 people beheaded on a football pitch, which weirdly enough, that barely got any headlines. But that's another story.
People don't cover what happens in Africa, I'm afraid. That's one of the problems. It's a sort of racism bias in the media.
Yeah, it'll be funny. You'll see, like, not funny in a sad way, but you'll see, let's say, CNN, and they'll talk breaking news, and they'll cover something about Justin Bieber, right? And then on the bottom, it'll be like 70 dead in Yemen strike.
Right.
Like, dude, you got your whole thing mixed up. Priorities mixed up. And we saw in Afghanistan recently there was a bombing, and it seems like for a while these things were a little bit subdued. This isn't anything new, obviously. But it seemed like in 2020, at least recently, there's been kind of a resurgence. Do you think, at least in the West, forget Africa for a second and what's going on in Afghanistan, but in the West, are we losing this culture war on free speech and individual expression?
Well, it's very difficult to say which way things are going, or because sort of implicit in your question is a sort of verdict of history. Right, and that sort of can't be written until it's over. So it's quite difficult to make a judgment. I mean, you could
at least that's progress, like where we are today versus where we were maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the timescale you have to work these things on is. I mean, so you could map two different cases. I think you could say, look, there's a huge movement of people all around the world. Obviously, Europe has gone quite quickly from being a relatively homogenous place of Christians, humanists, and some Jews to being an increasingly diverse place where people from all different sorts of ethnicities and creeds and religions as well are trying to live together. And you can, at the same time as being connected in some ways to other parts of the world as well, which is a damaging dimension. These days when people migrate, they don't, they can retain much more fuller links with their place of origin than in the past, for better or for worse. I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it's a fact. And so it leads to multiple identities, which are more difficult to navigate than or more complicated than migrants had to face 200 years ago when they got somewhere, and that was where they had to be, and they had to make whatever decisions and choices and adjustments to themselves and societies adjustments had to be made in that context. Now it's much more complicated.
Yeah.
And there's one way of looking at it, which is to say, in light of all that change, it's a really remarkable achievement how well we're doing in terms of integration, in terms of positive social attitudes towards each other. There's a lot of evidence that people feel very strong bonds with people of different religions, people of different ethnicities, and that includes everyone, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, Christians, non-religious people in general. And there was a recent report that looked at this, talked just about the UK again for a moment, where the headlines were excellent news. I mean, there was rising tolerance, rising, they asked the question that they always ask to check just how tolerant you are. How would you feel if someone in your family married someone who was ... right?
Yeah.
And it's like, atheist, Muslim, black, gay, whatever, long list of things. And the good news was that in every category, everyone, whether they were Muslim, Christian, non-religious, whatever, was more likely than in the past to say that would just be fine, right? So that the tolerance of everyone by everyone was rising. Now, it wasn't rising at the same rate, It was the case, obviously, that people of some religions were more intolerant than others. People of some ethnicities were more intolerant than others of difference and of marriage and so on. So that job's, not done. But the one argument is to say it's working really well. For one of the biggest experiments in history, the biggest social changes in history, it's working really well.
Yeah.
And this way of looking at it would say, yes, there are violent outbursts, there are violent incidents, but these are outliers on a trend that is in general going very well. And then there's another way of looking at it, which is saying, these aren't just violent incidents and outliers. These are a taste of things to come. They're a symptom of inevitable conflict. There is a clash going on that cannot be reconciled. And I don't believe there is the evidence for that second position at the moment. Who knows, that the evidence might stack up, and it might be that the verdict of history is different from the one that I think it currently is. Currently, I think the verdict of history will be that it's going pretty well. And if governments can hold their nerve, and if constitutions, as we were talking about earlier, if constitutions and institutions can be made firm enough, and particularly I'm thinking about the human rights frameworks and the secular nature of the laws of European states in particular, then I think that things, the future could be very bright. If they don't, if we allow ourselves to be influenced too much by those who say things like, make sort of multiculturalist arguments that we have to keep people separate, or that we have to dilute certain human rights in favor of other cultural norms, or that we, or that somehow certain people are just incapable of democratic secular life in a liberal sense. And I'm talking there about Islamic extremists, white nationalists, all the enemies of liberal, democratic, humanistic progress, which are quite a diverse range of enemies that we've got stacked up against this possibility. If we crumble in the face of that, then of course the future could be very grim. But at the moment, I think the future is looking okay.
I'm
most qualified to talk about Britain. So
I think it this isn't probably a general statement to make for the whole bloc that is the EU. It probably varies and changes between France and Spain and Great Britain and I don't know, Belgium, and it's different everywhere. But would you be in favor, for example, of, because I've seen this argument being kind of tossed around a little bit, to, let's say, not make fun of the prophet, right? Let's just not do that. Let's have a middle ground where we don't insult or make fun of or talk about the prophet in any sort of bad way, and therefore none of these things would happen in a in some sort of in theory, like this wouldn't happen in theory if we don't make that.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I mean, personally, that's not the sort of person I am.
Yeah.
Like I don't spend my time making fun of people and their beliefs and being terribly iconoclastic about things. That's not how I spend my time. But it's a bit awkward, because when people do it, of course, the moment someone actually does it, then you have to defend them, because this is absolutely their freedom and their right, and I trust that they have a good reason for wanting to do it, right? I mean, sometimes obviously not. I mean, there's a distinction to be drawn in the judgments that I would make about people's actions between people who are engaging, for example, in political satire, and people who are engaging in racist caricatures to whip up hatred, and these days, the line between those two things can be very thin and difficult to navigate. I mean, I've seen some things online shared by people I know, which I've thought, this is a racist cartoon. This is a racist trope. It depicts Muslims or black people or people from the Islamic State, or in this case the cartoon was about, as monkeys, as backward, as sort of like cave dwellers. And okay, you might think that the point you're making is that their religion is barbaric, their ideas are Neanderthal, and the norms that they're trying to enforce are prehistoric. But actually, what you're doing is drawing on really dehumanizing racist tropes, but they don't see that,
but nothing warrants a beheading,
and nothing. But yeah, exactly. And then even if they were whatever doing those things, violence is never a legitimate response, and certainly murder isn't a legitimate response. But that and both those things are true, right? So you can say it's shitty of people to want to make fun of other people, and I do believe that. But I accept that other people feel differently and they enjoy making fun of people, and it's they should be allowed to do so. But also, don't kill people. I mean, these are two things that are completely compatible.
Very basic stuff, yeah. Don't kill people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think there should be any censorship for political reasons whatsoever. I think that freedom of speech has limits. Freedom of expression has limits. I don't agree with the First Amendment in the United States.
You don't?
No, and international. It's. I mean, the First Amendment of the United States is, if it were introduced today, would be a clear violation of international law, because there are clear circumstances in most sort of developed thinking about the theory of freedom of expression, where you would say that you would limit freedom of expression. And the United States doesn't believe in the First Amendment really either, because case law in the United States through the Supreme Court has limited people's. I mean, there are laws on libel in the United States. Right? So, and that's the first obvious limitation of the right of freedom of expression, right? Sort of libel. And then John Stuart Mill's classic about, you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded theatre. So you don't get to cause harm, panic, and death through inappropriate words spoken in that way. Harassment is obviously, most countries accept that harassment is an unacceptable sort of free expression. Most countries accept that incitement to violence is a freedom of is a legitimate curb on freedom of expression. And I go along with most of those things, but they have to be so narrowly prescribed. I mean, they all have to be in the context of recognizing that the freedom of expression is the ultimate good. No other freedom can exist without freedom of thought and expression, of which freedom of speech is a part. This is the good thing. And yes, it may have to be constrained in certain circumstances, but those circumstances should always be to avoid actual harm, and they should always be strictly circumscribed by law. And in most human rights codes in the world, that's exactly the test that is applied.
Yeah, the problem is it becomes so Orwellian, so not nuanced in a way, because, and I'm seeing this, and I don't know if it was 300 or 3,000, but I believe last year, if I'm not mistaken, it's 3,000 people in the UK got arrested for hate speech, and a lot of them were really for ridiculous things. And in the US as well, you have, I don't like the fact that Nazis have a march down the streets, but if it's peaceful and they're not hurting anyone, there's nothing I can really do to stop them, right? And I'm Jewish, so not a big fan of Nazis, obviously. And if when you were talking about harassment, I've seen cases where a woman accused someone of harassment for winking at her. And so all these, when you start making concessions, and again, I'm not for Nazis, I'm not for harassment, I'm not for any of those things. I just feel like it loses a lot of nuance a lot of times, and you have
the law is nuanced. I mean, the law is not a matter of absolutes.
Yeah.
The law deals with real people in real situations which are messy. And so we just have to accept a certain level of nuance, I think. I mean, I've never heard of I don't know what happens in the United States, but I've never heard of a prosecution for winking, winking at someone. So there are usually legal tests on something like harassment, that it has to be ongoing, that it has to be persistent, that it has to be, create a humiliating or dehumanizing atmosphere. I mean, these are the tests that, I don't know if you're a lawyer, but these are the tests that you build into laws in order to have to prove a case. I'm not familiar with the 3,000 figure of people arrested that you mentioned. There certainly haven't been anywhere near that number of prosecutions, and there certainly haven't been anywhere near that number of successful prosecutions for any sort of hate crimes in the UK. There are different hate crime laws in different parts of the UK, but certainly it is the case that, it sounds like we just disagree about this, but I'm not a fundamentalist or an absolutist when it comes to freedom of expression. I think freedom of expression can and should be limited in some circumstances. I mean, sometimes it has to be punished after the event. You can't limit it in advance. But I do think that incitement to violence in many cases, and incitement to hatred in some cases, should be criminal offences, as they are in most parts of Europe. And that is an acceptable thing to do, because it prevents murder and violence. And the context of these being introduced, of course, these sorts of laws being introduced, is in the context of, firstly, genocide in Europe, and secondly, at some points in the history of the 20th century, very strained race relations, which absolutely led governments to think that they had to do something about racist hate speech. And then other categories, of course, have been brought into incitement of hatred offences. But the United Nations has a set of principles called the Rabat Principles, which lay out the sort of constraints that need to be put on any hate crime offences that are created in different governments. And I broadly agree with them. They're about context, they're about intent, they're about, there are many legal tests. And I agree with that use of the law.
Yeah, the UN is a little funny, because they on the Council of their Human Rights, they have countries like Saudi Arabia, China, some of the worst human atrocities that are currently happening in some of these countries, and these are the countries that are supposedly in charge of our Human Rights Council.
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because, of course, no state in the world doesn't violate human rights.
But some are worse than others.
Some are certainly worse.
Clearly say that. Yeah.
Some are certainly worse than others. I mean, that's not a criticism of the Human Rights Council. That's a criticism of the UN. Because the UN exists. I mean, you might say that the UN should halve its membership, because only half of the states of the UN can really claim to be, good faith signatories of the Charter, right? I mean, because clearly many states have signed, put their name to things like the Universal Declaration, who have no intention of attempting to follow its principles or apply those principles in law. But for as long as the UN exists, China has a perfect right to be on the Human Rights Council, the same as any other UN state has, because it's a body which elects states from the regions. Of course, the US left the Human Rights Council, which wasn't very helpful, and hopefully they'll come back. But you've got a choice. I mean, you live in this world. You've got a choice. Are you going to work with bad people to try and make the world better? Or are you going to say, you're so bad, I'm not going to work with you. Let's have a war instead. Let's blow the world up, So, I mean, I think it's always important to recognize when we're going with the lesser of two evils in a choice that we make. And also at the same time realizing that means we get less evil as a result, along the lines.
Yeah,
because I'm assuming you'd rather have China on the UN Human Rights Council and in the UN than a world war that kills us all, for example.
Are those the only two options?
I think
if those are the only two options, then yes.
They're two extreme options, but
yeah,
I think they are basically the two choices. You can either try and tie states up into an international system and hope that goodwill in the world and progressive ideas in the world will push things in a better direction than otherwise, or you can say, you're so bad you're out, and abandon all hope of negotiating your way into a better future by having states on the Human Rights Council and so on.
Yeah, well, the problem is, especially with China, is some of their human rights violations are so egregious, some of the worst, from human harvesting to what's happening with Uyghurs to, I mean, it's really endless, right? With animal rights issues.
They're a massive human rights abuser, of course.
Yeah. So, and because it's China and because it is basically the world's factory and it produces essentially most of the world's goods, I think the rest of the world kind of, it looks the other way. It doesn't really pay it as much attention as it should.
Unfortunately so. I mean, that's the reality of power. And it was true in the United States' heyday in the 20th century of American power. America got to do whatever it wants, overturn elected, heads of government across
Iran,
Latin America, just go everywhere and do whatever it felt like. And no one could do anything. In fact, the opposite, they excuse things that the United States is doing because of their power. And people now do the same with China. But again, what's the alternative to just letting, think of the British Empire, which terrorized the world, for decades, and also, like all empires, did good things too, did good and bad, but acted lawlessly in the world, because no one could do anything about it. Well, at least today there are international checks and constraints on something like American power in the past and Chinese power in the future. I mean, we know about the Uyghurs, right? China has to account for them, and when they talk about it in the United Nations, we read about it in them. I'd be much happier. I think you should be much happier to have China on the Human Rights Council than you should be to have them out of the UN and off the Human Rights Council.
I don't know. It's a tough one. The
Human Rights Council isn't like the king of human rights. To have China on the Human Rights Council is not to imply that they've got a medal somehow for human rights. It's just a treaty body in the UN.
Well, they do. They do put regulations. They do rule on certain things that are happening worldwide. Obviously, so that there is power there. But it's we'll move on from that. The final point is that I would say that this whole thing is extremely subjective, right? If you have, let's take Twitter, which is the judicial court of the internet, and that's where everything happens. You look at, for example, Khomeini, which is the spiritual leader in Iran, and his constant tweets about the annihilation of Israel and how this is what he wants to do. Nothing, right? Not a word by anyone, not condemnation. Twitter doesn't suspend his account. That's okay. But if you have someone, there's this British rapper / social commentator, I guess you could call him, Zubi, and he literally replied to someone and he said, "Dude," right? And I guess this person doesn't see themselves as a guy, although I think technically was a guy, and he got suspended. So again, It's very weird how they select what is offensive, what is not offensive, what calls for genocide, what doesn't. The rules are very blurry, and I don't think I think they're slanted in one direction.
Maybe.
Slanted.
I mean, I suppose it's very difficult to know because these are big, unaccountable private companies. I guess that's a problem, really.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you deal with that problem because the only alternative to big, unaccountable, well, there are lots of alternatives, I suppose, to big, unaccountable private companies. But I guess you would start to run into problems of who gets to decide, like how to regulate them, like who decides that the guy you mentioned is allowed to stay on and that the Ayatollah has to come off. Like it's very difficult to know what the alternative is because either
a wild west of free speech. Everyone can say what they want.
Why is that? And why is that good? Because it will obviously intrinsically privilege people with power and money and authority. I mean, free speech does not grow freely out of the soil. It has to be, the conditions have to be created for it, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have free speech in the Wild West. You had, the Wild West is an interesting phrase to use, right? You didn't have free speech. Yeah. You had people shooting each other for what they said or what they did. Free speech is a product of civilization, not of chaos and anarchy.
That's true.
So
it's a I don't have the answer to this. It's just something I like to discuss because I do see people being shut down. I do see
it happens all the time.
So,
yeah. I suppose some sort of independent. I mean, the way that sophisticated sort of political economies or states would deal with this sort of thing would be to have some sort of independent regulator, right? So you can think of an ideal situation as being one where you have a genuinely impartial ombudsman, such as is the case in many Northern European countries. I don't know what this. I inspect in the United States. You have inspectors and regulators and so on, but I get the impression often in the United States they're political appointments, so it doesn't quite work in an impartial way. I don't know quite how that works. But if you think about countries like the Nordic countries in Europe, or not the UK so much because they're often political appointments too, although some aren't. But you could create some sort of independent regulator of things, but then you have to be very strict about the rules you give them to enforce. So, for example, in advertising is always good to think about in terms of free expression. So, almost every country has some sort of law about advertising. Like you can't say that your magic oil is going to cure AIDS. You just can't sell it. You can't say that and sell it because that's a breach of some sort of advertising regulation. And if you have
you can't say it cures, but you can say it helps.
You can say it helps, can you?
It's all about it's all about language. America? You probably could if you could find, because I've been on the side of consumer goods, and if it's all about language, you can't say it cures it. But if you can say that somehow it helps, you can put that on the label.
Well, in the UK, you would not be able to say that unless you could prove that it helped, and that's the case, I think, in other Northern and Western European countries. So I think that advertising regulation might give you a good case study to think about how expression more generally can be regulated on big platforms like Twitter. I mean, not in like our own homes when we're talking to each other, or when in the streets when we're talking to each other, or when we want to publish our books or whatever. Not there, but on a big platform like this, which is essentially a private publisher that's opened its platform to anyone they choose to allow on it, right? And so you could introduce some sort of regulation, and the analogy with advertising is quite interesting. So if you take an advertising regulator, you normally say, okay, advertising is a thing that happens, and it's good that it happens because people get to learn about things and then buy things, and information is conveyed, and this is good for society and good for the economy, good for politics, good for everything. And then you have a code that applies, which might say things like, you can only say that your medicine cures warts if you've got some evidence that it does. Right, and then you set up a regulator to adjudicate on complaints that come in as a result of that. Right, I think that's a perfectly sensible situation. and could be applied to something like large publishers like Twitter. But the problem, of course, instantly is what's the code going to say? Like, what are the rules going to be? What are the rules that the regulator is going to implement? And we do have problems in the UK in that over time, the advertising regulation code has ruled out things like offence. And so including offence on religious grounds. So things that are, perfectly acceptable, in my view, to say have been prevented from being said in advertising. I mean, the argument could be run that you've got other spaces where you can say those things. But, there's a principle there to defend. So I don't know what you would say in relation to social media. I know you haven't asked me to develop a scheme where we can regulate Twitter, but I'm treating your question as if it is that.
I'm writing this all down. I'm patenting
and I
this,
think it is possible. But I do reject your idea that it should simply be unmediated, unmoderated, free for all. I don't think that is productive or civilized, and I don't think that free speech flourishes in a situation like that. I think that free speech is something that doesn't just need to be allowed, it has to be defended and protected as well. And you have to protect the right to free expression of the vulnerable and the easily silenced. And that doesn't happen in a free-for-all Wild West situation. In those situations, the weakest go to the wall.
I'm just...
It's not easy.
First to the idea. No, it's not. And that's why they haven't exactly figured it out, because it's so difficult. But I'm just allergic to the idea that there is some big brother listening to everything, or not listening maybe, but looking at everything that I'm writing and other people are writing and basing that on some sort of inner algorithm or some complicit or implicit bias that they have. And then based on that, they're like, hey, come here. You said something that is not allowed, and now you're going to have to go to court or to some sensitivity training. Like, I think actually a better idea would be, and again, like we're trying to improve Twitter now, but like if we could eliminate bots and anonymity from these sites where
that's two good bits of regulation.
Yeah, you would have to sign up with like your license. Not that this would be something that people can see, but you would have to be an actual physical, real person with accountability. And I think people would be much nicer on the internet if that was the case.
I think that's an excellent bit of regulation. I approve. I'm glad to see you diluting the First Amendment. I think that it's very welcome. I'm glad. I think that you should do that. That's a good bit of regulation. I also think that a lot of the things that you've just said that you wouldn't like about the Big Brother intrusion, they're not things that are inherent or intrinsic to regulation necessarily. I mean, it doesn't have to be opaque and big brotherly. You can have transparent rules that are available transparently. You can have every adjudication published with its decisions for why you've taken it. I mean, this is why what we do in court of laws, right? Judgments aren't. I agree that secret judgments are bad, right? That's definitely not a good way to regulate anything. If you've made a judgment, it should be published, and the reasons why should be published.
Do you really want taxpayer money to be spent on and court time to be spent on people ruling that what other people said is wrong?
Absolutely not. I don't think that should be something that's done on these platforms at all. I think that Twitter should have to pay for this. I think that if this big publisher is going to operate and be told that it has to, be regulated, that there's a job for self-regulation. There's a role for self-regulation there, there's space for self-regulation. So when Twitter, as you say, so you gave an example, I'm not familiar with the case, but you gave an example of someone who'd said something and had it removed or been removed themselves as a user, whatever. Let's say that there's a person who does something, they're removed as a user. I would say if that happens, then this was Twitter, right? Yeah. Then Twitter should have to say, this person did this thing, someone complained about it, it violated, the regulations that we have for these reasons, and that's why we did this, and that should be published somewhere if they're going to do it. I think that's fair enough. I mean, we give them an awful lot of power and freedom in our society to operate their business model in the way that they do. So I think we can expect transparency from them in return. But I do think that, that might be acceptable in some cases. Violent scenes of abuse. That's a very obvious one to me. Violent child abuse, which is published online and disseminated through these channels. Things that are said, incitements to violence, incitements to violence on grounds of sex or gender or race or sexual orientation. All these incitements. I think that it's fine for a publisher to say, we're just not going to let you do that. That's harmful to people and we don't want it. And then to say, but to do it transparently. To say, and this is why we're not going to allow it, and you've done this, and we've decided that it's true that you've done this, and here's our reasons why, and that's not allowed. Not in my house.
Yeah.
It's a private platform after all.
Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing. It's a private business. I mean, they can do what they want, actually.
Well, they're public, but they're.
Are they? What, Twitter?
It's yeah.
Well, then they can definitely be regulated.
That's what but the question is, are they, like you said, public or private, where they can dictate their own rules, do whatever they want, up the whims of the board and the investors, or are they more like a public utility company, like the phone company, where they have to give you an account, like they have to give you a phone line? Is that the same thing where everyone is under the everyone should be allowed to do it, regardless of what they say, how they say it, and who they say it to?
Well,
so that's the question.
Yeah, I guess that is the question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Let's move on a little bit. Something that I was interested in. What is the, because I couldn't really find too much about this, but what is the humanist position or outlook on animal welfare?
Well, humanists have been some of the pioneers of good treatment of other animals. If you think about a humanist philosopher like Jeremy Bentham, who was the first to say, his famous quote, "The question is not can they reason, but can they suffer?" Or the humanist philosopher Peter Singer, who's done so much work on even the rights of animals, the potential for other animals to have rights in legally enforceable rights. I think that it's much to the credit of humanists that they've been at the head often of the movements to bring other animals into our moral circle of moral responsibility. And that's the way that I would look at it, is that a humanist approach to morality is not one that leans on commandments or any moral injunctions outside of ourselves. It's one that bases itself, a humanist approach to morality is one that bases itself on fellow feeling, on empathy, and, like I said earlier, on reason, being able to work through the consequences of your actions. And like the moment that that's your frame for morality, then of course suffering matters. Whoever is suffering, and if we are animals, which we are, and other animals aren't so different from us, and we don't want to create suffering in the world, and in fact the opposite, we want to try and increase well-being in the world and happiness in the world, then of course other animals have to be part of our moral calculations. I think then you get into lots of debates that are still within a humanist frame, but where different humanists might have different views on things like, how much weight do you give another animal's welfare compared with a human being, for example? How much, what is it reasonable to do to try and reduce animal suffering? And some people would say, well, I don't need any animal products in my life. I don't need them. I won't die without animal products. I can live in a house that has no animals harmed in the making of it. I can wear clothes that have not harmed animals. I can eat food that hasn't harmed animals, and I can take medicines and use cosmetic products that haven't harmed animals. So really, I've got an obligation to do that, because that way I can reduce my impact on their suffering completely. And that's a perfectly legitimate view. It's probably the right one, actually. But most of us are just trying our best and not achieving that extreme of moral purity. There'll be others who would say, well, look, I'm not going to give a non-human animal the same weight in my moral calculations as an animal. So I'm sorry, but if the suffering of this kitten is going to save the lives of everyone with malaria, then I'm afraid that animal testing is going to have to be done, because these people matter more than this non-human animal. And I think that's defensible too. I think that's also a defensible position, though that doesn't mean that doesn't magically make harming kittens right. It just means it might be a better choice than the other choice that you had available to you in that situation. So that's where a humanist would usually sit with that. So it's definitely true that an unusually larger number of humanists than religious people are vegetarian or vegan or have adopted a lifestyle, but through moral choices that limits their impact on other animals. But it's also true that there are humanists who haven't. But I would say that most humanists are going to take this seriously. This is a serious question, and of course, it's risen to the top of many people's agendas in the West.
Yeah. So there's no official position. It's kind of a little gray area.
Yeah. Well, there's no official
lean this way. Some.
Yeah. There's no official humanist position on anything. I mean, it's not. This isn't an organized dogmatic movement. This is a broad, ongoing ethical conversation. Amongst people who've got the same frame for answering these questions. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. It's something that I don't. It's not like I go back and forth, but I stopped eating meat about, I want to say 8 years ago, and originally it wasn't even for ethical reasons, was environmental reasons. But the more I studied, the more I went into it, the ethical part became very, very a large part of it. But the health part is, I feel like, the most difficult one, and not because it is healthy or unhealthy. It is because there's just so much misinformation out there. And I honestly don't know what is the right diet. And I think at the end of the day, morals aside, ethics aside, environmental responsibility aside, I think most people are going to go with what they feel good with. And that's kind of, at the end of the day, there are those purists that are going to try to be vegan as much as possible. But at the end of the day, if they don't feel good, and that's why I'm very happy with the direction that the consumer goods has gone, because now you have, just so many options out there where you didn't have those exist 10 years ago. And now you have the lab grown meat. I don't know how that's going to be of taste, but I would try that. I would definitely try that.
I tried some. It was interesting.
You did?
Yeah.
How was it?
Yeah, it was nice. It was dry. It's quite dry.
Dry.
Yeah. But I understand this is one of the problems.
Ways.
It was. I can't remember where it was. It was at some event where they were showcasing sort of these experimental things, and it was quite dry because they have problems.
They've got some ways to go.
They have some problems with the fat because they can't grow fat cells. They can grow, like the protein cells or something, but they can't, or they couldn't at that point anyway, grow the fat cells. So they have to blend in vegetable oils to make it taste really like a beef burger. I mean, that's the issue.
Give them like 10 years. I feel like in about 5 to 10 years, they'll probably be able to come up with something that's as good as the real thing.
I think so. I think that's very much to be welcomed. I mean, you mentioned the environmental arguments as being different from the ethical arguments, but of course they're ethical arguments too. They're just a different sort of ethical frame. And I think they've got to be taken seriously as well. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. That was my biggest thing. And that's a whole different topic.
Yes.
Before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about your latest book, Little Book of Humanism.
Very good.
I want you to talk a little bit about it, what inspired you to write it, and just tell people a little bit more about it.
Well, it's I'm not sure if it's distributed yet in the US, but it will be very shortly. I think the US distribution.
You can buy it on Amazon.
Oh, you can. Okay, good. Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Well, it's we thought, my co-author and I, Alice Roberts, who's a biologist and the current president of Humanist UK. She and I had the idea for this book because, a lot of what's been reflected in our conversation today, a lot of books about humanism or talk about humanism is very philosophical, it's quite intellectual, and we wanted to do a book that really instead presented the humanist approach to life as what it is, not just an intellectual preoccupation, but an emotional attitude, a worldview, a way of being, a way of living, a way of thinking about, our where we've come from, who we are, where we're going, not just something that's cerebral and intellectual. And so that was the attitude we had to write this book. We also wanted it to be very positive. So we didn't have any of the chapters starting about, what humanists don't believe in. So often it's sort of humanists don't believe in gods. They're non-religious. They don't think there's an external source to morality and so on. We didn't want that sort of thing. So we wanted to be very positive. And that's what we did as we went through the book. So to promote humanism not just as an intellectual thing, to be very positive. We also wanted to surprise people with humanists that they didn't know were humanists. So half the book is quotes. They're quotes from different humanists, and we have put our own text next to those quotes. But we deliberately chose people who were humanists but were known for something else. So George Orwell, you mentioned him earlier, for example. Not many people know that he was a self-described humanist, had this approach to life.
Really?
Yeah, he wrote his quotes about humanists are in the book. He was mostly anti-Christian, really. I mean, it was that was where his humanist attitude came from, and anti-Christian might not be quite fair. I mean, he was against any religion that thought that there was a life after death. I mean, that was I think his big problem. So James Baldwin, the American essayist and novelist George Eliot, people who Bevan, who was a UK politician who was the architect of our National Health Service, Beveridge, who was a UK politician who was the architect of our welfare state, a woman called Jenny Lee, who was the architect of the Open University in the UK, which is sort of online university that was from the 60s that everyone could do a degree at and so on. So from the UK point of view, at least, but also hopefully for US readers, people who would surprise people, that they would go, I never knew that my favorite novelist was a humanist, or that my most admired political, activist was a humanist. So we did that. There's those people all throughout the book. We also wanted to illustrate how the humanist approach is not just a Western one, because a lot of what we're used to as Westerners, of course, is we're used to thinking about Western humanists. We used to think about like the influence of Voltaire and Darwin as a thinker, and the sort of people I've just talked about, actually, all the people I just quoted. And of course, although the humanist approach to life has become extremely dominant in the West, and there's no doubt that it has influenced our laws, our lives, our arts, our culture, our attitude, everything from Star Trek to the way we order our politics. The humanist view in the last few centuries has been influential. It isn't only a Western phenomenon, and there are people saying humanist things and thinking humanist thoughts 2,500 years ago in China and India, and more recently in Latin America and Africa. So we wanted to showcase that global nature as well, because it's an important part, obviously, of the humanist claim that this is not a codified set of dogmas that anyone had to write down, invent, and then promulgate. This is an approach to life which can be worked at by any human being, anywhere, with simple access to the world around them and their own senses and experience. So, unsurprisingly, in light of that, there have been humanists for as long as there have been humans writing down their ideas about things, and we wanted to showcase that. And we also wanted to showcase, as well as the global diversity, the length of time that there have been humanists. So, we do quote Indian philosophers from 2,500 years ago and Chinese philosophers from 2,600 years ago, as well as, characters from The Good Place and so on. So, I mean, it's a long term view that we established as well. So that was our point. We wanted to try and make it available to a mass market, and it's illustrated, it's nice quotes, and it's sold extremely well. I mean, it's been reprinted 6 times since it was published just a few months ago.
Really?
And,
wow.
Yeah, and it's become in the UK a till side book. I don't know whether you have this in the US, but you call it a checkout, I suppose. That in bookshops, they're the books that they pile by a checkout. So the sort of books they hope
Yeah.
people will get to the checkout and they'll go, oh yeah, that one, and they'll pick that up as well. And so that's good positioning for it. You know, it's cheap. It's something like $7 or something. So it's a good little book. It's attractive. It's small. It's cheap. And so it's done very well, and we're very pleased.
I love that Tillside. Yeah, the Brits have those little sayings. I love it.
Well, you call it a checkout?
Correct. Yeah. Even on Amazon, you have basket, we have checkout.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Little differences.
Little cultural differences.
Andrew, thank you so much. I had a great time. This was very insightful, very educational, and I'm glad we could have an honest and open conversation.
It was very nice to speak to you. Thank goodness. Let's just be grateful the First Amendment allowed it.
If I get a knock on my door tomorrow, I'm going to know who to go to, all right?
Don't even think about it.
Guys, make sure to check out the book. It's on Amazon. It's a great book. I ordered it the other day. Should get it soon. And yeah, where can people find you on the interweb? Where's the best place?
Well, Humanist UK is humanists.uk. Humanist International, that I'm currently the president of, is humanists.international. These are very easy web addresses. I guess there's my website too, which is andrewcopson.com.
And you're on Twitter and all the other platforms,
at Andrew
or just Twitter?
Copson, yes, where I have never yet had one of my posts removed. You'll be glad to hear.
Yet. All right, Andrew Copson, everybody. Thank you so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed our time.
Thank you.